Hello, and welcome to another edition of Day Drinking with Kevin. I get emails all the time saying, Kevin, I really want to know more about wine, but I lack the vocabulary to feel comfortable to be talking about wine in either social or work situations. Can you help me with that? So in this episode, we're going to talk about some basic wine terminology and vocabulary you can use to feel more comfortable about wine and increase your wine drinking experience. Today, we're going to talk about red wine vocabulary. And the most important thing about red wine is it has a color. And a lot of times people look at red wines and say, how do I describe the color of red wine? Well, most of the time it's going to be garnet or ruby or purple, maybe sometimes red or brick color. And it's either going to be light, medium, or dark. This has a lot to do with how much skin has been exposed to the juice when it's fermenting, and it also has to do with the grape varietal itself. Now, when looking at a wine's color, don't hold it up to the ceiling or hold it over the table where you're eating. It's only going to be influenced by the color of the ceiling or the color of the table. When I'm judging a wine's color, I like to look at it over a white background. That could be a napkin, a piece of paper, the back of a menu. So remember, when evaluating color, look at it over a white background. First, let's talk about the nose, the bouquet, or the aroma wine gives out. As many of you know, wine is the second most complex liquid in the world next to human blood, and the aromas of the bouquet of wines are amazing, and many of them are unique to the grape varietal and the regions that they come from. For today's episode, let's just take a sniff of our wine. And the first thing I want you to do is tell me, do you have floral? Do you have fruit flavors? Or does it smell more earthy? This is going to tell us a little bit about the climate that it came from. Next, I want you to swirl the wine a little bit. This is called oxidizing the esters. And smell it again. And see if we can further define. If it's fruity in nature, is it fresh fruits like strawberries and cherries? Is it stewed fruits? Is it bruised fruits? Are they dark fruits or blue fruits? If it's earthy in nature, is it something like mushrooms or herbal or mineral driven? And, this is going to tell us a little bit about maybe where it came from and possibly the grape varietal as well. But for today's episode, let's just say, is it floral, earthy, or fruity in nature? And then maybe try to pick out one or two characteristics that would help describe it. Now, here's what we're all for, tasting the wine. And here we call this on the palate. First of all, we're going to take a small sip in our mouth. Swirl it around. And there are several different components that go into evaluating a wine's palate. When it comes to a wine's acidity, what we're evaluating is how does it make your mouth feel? What's the level of moisture in your mouth after we take a drink of wine? Does our mouth feel dry? Does it feel maybe like it's just starting to get a little moist? Does it feel like there's a sprinkler going on there? Or is there a swimming pool? The more moisture that's in your mouth, the higher the acid in the wine. Now, where does that acid come from? Grapes start off as almost 100% acid and very little sugar. And as they ripen, the sugar and the acid tend to balance out. In cooler climates, you get wines that are higher in acidity and lower in sugar. In warmer climates, because the grapes get riper, you get higher sugar and less acidity. So when we're talking about acid, we're talking about how does it make your mouth feel and what level of saliva do you have in your mouth as a result of the wine that you're drinking. Next, let's talk about tannins. Now, I've done an entire episode on tannins, but it is the astringency or the dryness that comes from a wine. As we learned before, wines that have thin skins or exposed less to the juice during fermentation tend to have low tannins, like Pinot Noir. Merlot might be the next step up, Cabernet may be the next step up, and things like Tannat and Petite Syrah may be the highest level there. When you are pairing wines with foods, a lot of times you want to pair higher tannin wines with foods that have things like higher salt content and higher fat content. Whereas if you're pairing wines with low tannins, you want to pair wines that don't have a lot of those things. For example, a Pinot Noir and salmon and tuna go very well. Pinot Noir also goes great with charcuterie and stewed foods. Next, let's talk about alcohol. And my favorite component in wine is the alcohol. Where does the alcohol come from? It comes from the fermentation. And as I said before, the higher the sugar level in the grape at the time of harvest, the higher the alcohol potential is on the back end. So, wines from California in a warm climate tend to have a higher alcohol percentage, maybe 14.5 or 15%, over, say, wines from Bordeaux, which tend to have an alcohol level of 13 to 13.5%. This is because as we get a grape more ripe, the bigger sugar content tends to translate into more alcohol on the back end. Next, let's talk about sweetness. Now, most red wines are going to be dry. In fact, there's only a handful of red wines out there that are sweet. Things like Moscato, or a sparkling Shiraz from Australia, or possibly some wines from Italy, again, are going to be sweet, but the majority of them are going to be dry. And what do I mean by that? Well, wines can come in a variety of different sweetnesses, from dry to off-dry to medium sweet to sweet. And as we put them in our mouth, we're going to be able to tell a little bit about the residual sweetness in the wine. Now, we'll cover sweetness more often when we're talking about dessert wines or other types of wines. In red wines, most of the time we're talking about dry wines. And that's why red wines pair so well with meats like hamburgers and pork chops and lamb and all the kind of winter foods that we might have, like pot roast and brisket and anything out of a crock pot. So when evaluating a red wine, we're going to talk a lot about dry red wines. And finally, let's talk about the flavors we get from a wine. When we put it in our mouth, let it warm up a little, we're actually going to hopefully taste a lot of the things that we taste when we were evaluating the wine on the nose. For example, is it fruity in nature? Is it earthy in nature? Does it have a tannic or dry astringency? Or is it minerality driven? These are all going to tell us about the grapes and maybe where it came from. Here, again, first decide, is it fruity or earthy? This might tell us that it came from California or an old world country like France. Next, try to determine, is it fruit like cherries and strawberries? Or is it earthy like mushrooms and herbal in flavor? Or is it minerality like wet stones and graphite? Those are all things that you can use to describe wines, and will help you to enjoy the wine and also decide what food you're going to pair it with as well. Well, that's our red wine vocabulary for the day. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, hit the little like below and consider subscribing to Day Drinking with Kevin. And if you have ideas for future episodes, please put them in the comments below and I'll get to them as soon as I can. Until next time, this is Kevin McGuire saying, salute.